Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. In today's video, what I want to discuss is the deepest meditative attainment in all of early Buddhism besides enlightenment itself. It's an odd, a strange meditative attainment, one that's not well described, but we'll try to give as much information as we can about it in today's video. It's known as the meditation on the cessation of perception and feeling. And this seems to be a state of such profound stillness, of such profound peace, that it's essentially like being in a deep, dreamless sleep, or perhaps even sometimes it's described as kind of a suspended animation, although I sort of have my doubts about that. And it has other, at least claimed, sort of supernatural abilities that we'll get to in a bit. Now, in one early text, there is the question about what the differences are between this cessation of perception and feeling and death itself, because these are really understood to be very similar kinds of states. It's said that the differences are that in this state, one is literally still alive. There's still a sort of vitality involved in the body and mind. It's said that the body is still warm. There's no mention of breathing. I wonder about that because sometimes, it's said that the fourth jhana, sort of, which is a lighter meditative state, sort of has trouble coexisting with breathing. So I sort of wonder about that. But in any event, it says that the body is still warm. And it also says that one difference here is that the sense faculties, or indriyani, are very clear. Now, this is an odd kind of thing to say because within the state there is no sensory data at all. There's no sense experience at all. So I'm not sure what it means to say that the senses are clear. The only sense I can make of that is that what it means to say is that when we exit the state, when we come out of it with very, very clear, lucid senses. And this is this certainly would be sensible. It would make sense, but it at least is something of a question what it might mean if it doesn't mean that. Now, another subject we might want to tackle here is how we achieve this cessation of perception and feeling. There'll be a bit to say about that, which I'll be getting into in the rest of the video, but for the purposes of right now, it's not well described how we get there in these early texts. However, this attainment in the early texts always follows upon an earlier attainment of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, which is the fourth of the four formless attainments. I just did a video on the formless attainments. If you're interested in those, I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes, and you can take a look at that. But that fourth formless attainment of neither perception nor non-perception is itself a very subtle and, as I've said in that video, liminal kind of meditation attainment. So it itself is very difficult to describe, and so any sort of use of that attainment to attain yet something deeper is going to be even more difficult to describe. But at least we know from the text that that's the route to this cessation of perception and feeling. Now, if we want more information on how to go about this attainment, there is one early text in which a very accomplished nun, Dhammadina, is asked precisely that question. And her response is, well, at least somewhat revealing. What she says is, "A mendicant who is entering such an attainment does not think, 'I will enter the cessation of perception and feeling,' or 'I am entering the cessation of perception and feeling,' or 'I have entered the cessation of perception and feeling.' Rather, their mind has been previously developed so as to lead to such a state." That is, since the mind has essentially shut off when we're in this attainment of cessation of perception and feeling, basically the mind has stopped. So we can't be making any determinations or judgments or decisions or anything within the state. Whatever we do has to be done beforehand. And The prior state, this state of neither perception nor non-perception, is itself so liminal and deep and absorbed that it's hard to understand how we could make a decision even within that state. So, presumably, whatever decision we make about achieving this cessation of perception and feeling sort of has to be done initially before we begin our meditation session. Though how precisely that is done is somewhat obscure. Probably because there's not much that we could say about it. We make a determination before we enter into our meditations on the formless attainments, and then at some point when we're in this very subtle attainment of neither perception nor non-perception, we are perhaps able simply to fall into cessation of perception and feeling. Looking for other information on this attainment in the early texts, we find a different text in which this attainment is associated with certain supernatural abilities. So, for example, in one text, Moggallana, an early disciple of the Buddha, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, discusses a prior disciple named Sanjiva, that is to say, a disciple of a prior Buddha many eons in the past. So this is a kind of a story about the distant past, where Moggallana says that this monk, Sanjiva, was out meditating in a seated posture and entered the cessation of perception and feeling. And he was in that state for a great deal of time. The villagers came up to him and believed that he had simply died during meditation. And so they took his body and they put it on a funeral pyre, as was common in ancient India, and tried to burn his body. So they lit the funeral pyre up, and the next morning the fire had died down and Sanjiva was unburned. And the reason he was unburned is because he was in that meditative attainment, and the meditative attainment protected him from fire. Now, in the early tradition itself, there's not much more said about this state. However, in the later tradition, there is more said about it. In particular, in the 1st or 2nd century Vimuttimagga, it is said that this is a state that is only achievable by arahants or non-returners. That is to say, the cessation of perception and feeling can only be attained either by people who are already enlightened or by people who are at the stage directly prior to enlightenment. In other words, extremely advanced practitioners. That same idea that this meditative attainment is not open to just anybody, but only to a select group of people, is then repeated in a number of later texts, in particular in Buddhaghosa's 5th century of the Common Era Visuddhimagga, which was partly based upon the earlier Vimuttimagga. He again also takes this information from the Vimuttimagga. He also claims that that this attainment is only open to people who are already enlightened, or to non-returners, that is, people at the very final stage before enlightenment. Buddhaghosa also makes the claim, or at least the implication, that when we enter this state, we can decide how long we want to remain in it, and we will then remain in it for that period of time. Now, it's not, again, there's a lot of unclarity here. Presumably, this is only going to be appropriate for somebody who is very skilled at this attainment. The first time you attain it, you don't know you're going to attain it, I would think, because you can't really predict such a thing. But Buddhaghosa says that at least somebody who is proficient in this will be able to say beforehand, I want to remain in the cessation of perception and feeling for, 3 hours, and then they will remain in it for that period of time, and after 3 hours they will wake up. He says, unless, we'll remain in it for that period of time unless either we die while we're in the attainment, or we are summoned by the Sangha, or we are summoned by a Buddha. Again, the idea being here that if the Sangha or a Buddha summons us, we will immediately wake up out of the attainment and be aware of it. Something which is kind of funny to think about, but at least that's what he claims. And Buddhaghosa also goes on to say that, I mean, at least in one of his descriptions, he says that he gives an example of someone remaining or deciding to remain in the attainment for 7 days. And I have heard other people talk about 10 days and long periods of time. The idea being here that this attainment is one that presumably one can decide to remain in for great periods of time. In other words, one remains in this position, in this deep meditative absorption that is akin to either dreamless sleep or sort of a kind of suspended animation for days on end. Whether or not anyone is actually able to do that is an open question. Whether this can be demonstrated is an open question. But at least these are things that are stated in the Visuddhimagga, again, a 5th century text about 1,000 years after the Buddha's day, so may or may not reflect what was going on in the early Sangha. Now, I mentioned that this attainment is open, was said, at least in the early centuries of the Common Era, to be only achievable by awakened or enlightened beings or non-returners. Many of you may have questions about what a non-returner is. I did an earlier video on the subject of these stages towards enlightenment, and I'll leave a link to that video down below, or I should say up here on the screen as well, in case you want to see that or see it again, refresh your memory. Check out my Patreon page if you're getting something out of these videos of mine. See if you want to help support the channel and get some fun things in return as well. Thanks so much to all of you, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.